Continue learning about the front piece crochet method. The front piece also consists of the hem, the body, the underarm, and the shoulder parts. The hem is identical to the back piece's hem. The overall pattern for the rest of the positions is mostly the same as the back piece, except the stitch count and row count are slightly different. For the position of the garter stitch, you need to use Intarsia or jacquard methods to crochet the corresponding pattern. Everyone should finish the rows before the body pattern and the hem first. You can see that. Here we've finished the first 3 rows. And starting from row 4, we begin the pattern. Pay attention to the front piece chart. The colors of the squares represent the corresponding yarn colors. First, learn the method for crocheting the pattern. Then after you've learned it, proceed based on your actual situation, and refer to the pattern while crocheting. Intarsia is the method of carrying yarn vertically, while jacquard involves carrying yarn horizontally. It's important to note that, when crocheting with either Intarsia or jacquard, you should prepare some small yarn balls in advance, for convenience while crocheting. For example, this section with color 1, where the number of stitches in these rows are quite high. If the main color yarn is carried horizontally, there will be a lot of it. In this case, you can use the Intarsia method to carry the yarn vertically. Therefore, you'll need a small ball of color 1 yarn in the middle, and in reality, you'll need a small ball of main color yarn on each side. But to reduce the amount of cutting the yarn, we can turn the leftover main color yarn here into a small yarn ball, and directly wrap it into a small ball. On the other side, make a separate small yarn ball of the main color yarn. Here, I'll show you the figure 8 method. For wrapping small yarn balls, there are 2 scenarios. One is taking yarn from an independent yarn ball and wrapping it. The other is when the yarn is connected to the fabric piece. Regardless of which, the wrapping method is the same. First, leave a yarn tail of about 10 centimeters, or slightly longer if you prefer. This yarn tail will be the one you pull out later. Place it at the base of your left thumb, with your thumb holding it in place. Then wrap it in a figure 8 pattern around your hand like this. If the yarn is connected to the fabric piece while wrapping a small yarn ball, do it like this. Note that one end of the yarn is connected to the fabric piece, making it convenient to pull the yarn later. Wrap the yarn with moderate tension. The size of the small yarn ball can be estimated based on the pattern chart, which means estimating according to the stitch count of the color block. The more stitches in a color block, the more yarn you should wrap. The fewer stitches in a color block, the less yarn you can wrap. If there isn't enough yarn later, you can join new yarn and continue knitting. Once you've roughly wrapped the yarn to the needed size, leave a tail and cut the yarn. Then tie a knot like this. You can first wrap the middle a few times to secure it. If the yarn is slippery, you can tie additional knots. If the yarn tail here is too long, you can trim it slightly shorter. This is the method for wrapping the small yarn ball. When using it, just gently pull the yarn like this. The advantage of winding small yarn balls is that while knitting, the yarn is relatively secured. The yarn ball won't slide down. When there are multiple yarn balls, they're less likely to get tangled with each other. It's convenient for knitting if you reach the end of the small yarn ball. If it becomes a bit loose, you can take it apart and wind it again. Or if you make a mistake while knitting and have to undo a lot of yarn, you can also wind the undone yarn into another small yarn ball. This end here is still connected to the workpiece. After winding it, secure this part with the yarn. That should do it. Next, you can wind up the small yarn balls as needed for starting your knitting. This pattern starts from row 4, which means you'll be working it on the wrong side. Read the chart from left to right and start by knitting normally with the original main color yarn, and continue until you finish the first stitch in color 1. I have fewer stitches here, and there are no garter stitch edges on both sides, so I'll just explain the method. After finishing, I'll explain how to join the yarn, whether it's on the right side or the wrong side. The method for joining the yarn is the same. Here, I'm joining the yarn on the wrong side. Take the new yarn and make a knot with the original yarn. Pull it to the base. And that's how you join the yarn. If you're joining the yarn on the right side, do it after the first stitch before changing colors, then tie the new yarn with the original yarn and pull it to the base. After joining the yarn, refer to the pattern and use this yarn to knit the corresponding number of stitches, which is 9 stitches here. Once completed, add a small ball of main color yarn and continue knitting. We're using the Intarsia method here, so this main color yarn stays in place. And switch to color 1 for knitting. The yarn tails can be hidden later. After finishing, you need to join the main color yarn again here. And leave color 1 in place. Use this yarn to finish this row. And continue with the number of stitches at the beginning of the next row, which is right here. After knitting the starting color, the next stitch switches back to this yarn. While the original yarn pauses, note that you should place the yarn that's pausing above. And the yarn about to knit below. Essentially crossing the two yarns. Then start knitting the corresponding number of stitches. After we knit one stitch, let's look at the wrong side. The yarn that paused is now underneath. Which makes the textures of the two colors join tightly, not loose, and doesn't affect the appearance. The yarn pulled over here shouldn't be too tight, the tension should be just right. Let's take another look at the chart. You can see that the original main color yarn ends here, which is 4 stitches apart. From the start of this row, we can bring the main color yarn along. While knitting these 4 stitches in color 1, first knit the stitches before color 1. Keep knitting until there are 4 stitches left. Which means knitting until you reach the position of the main color yarn. We press down the yarn we need to carry every 3 stitches or so. Ensuring that after knitting, the carried yarn is pressed down like this. If the ending position of this yarn in the previous row is less than 3 stitches apart, from where the current row will start. Then there's no need to press down the yarn here. You can simply pull it over and knit. After knitting with color 1, usually, this yarn stays put. But let's look at the pattern chart. We can see that the next row of color 1 starts from here, which is quite a distance away from where it ends here. So we can carry this main color yarn while knitting this section. Carry this color 1 yarn as you knit, stopping close to where you need it. When carrying yarn, do so after every 3 stitches or so, pressing down the yarn you need to carry. On the wrong side, you can clearly see that color 1 has been held down. Once you've carried it close to the beginning position for the next row, stop again. After carrying the yarn, gently stretch the fabric piece. To prevent it from being too tight, the fabric piece shrinks up, affecting the appearance. Continue knitting normally to finish this row. After finishing, first knit the main color yarn at the start of the next row, then switch to color 1 to knit. Leave this yarn here. When you reach this point, carry the main color yarn from the end of the previous row over a few stitches on this side. Then switch to the main color yarn to finish the rest of this row. I've already knitted the main color yarn at the start of this row. Note: Every time you switch yarns to knit, whether right side or wrong side, cross the two yarns. Usually, the yarn about to be knitted is brought up from below. Then continue knitting. Here it gets caught under. Continue knitting this row. Note: when knitting at the junction of the two colors, you can tighten the loop slightly. Carrying the yarn on the wrong side is the same as on the right side, which means ensuring that after knitting, this yarn is underneath. After knitting with color 1, continue using the main color yarn to finish this row. After finishing this row, continue knitting the next row. On the right side, start with the main color yarn here, knit the beginning stitch count. Then switch to color 1 to knit these few stitches. At this point, you don't need to add a new small ball of main color yarn. Use this small ball for Intarsia knitting, which means bringing the yarn over to knit the main color here. For the following rows, you can also use this small ball here, using the Intarsia method, to knit these two color blocks. Which means every time you knit a few stitches in color 1, bring the main color yarn over. If it's less than 3 stitches, just pull the yarn over and knit. I've already knitted the beginning in the main color. Now I'll continue with color 1. After knitting the stitch count in color 1, the main color yarn is brought over. If there are fewer than 3 stitches here, pull the main color yarn over and knit. After knitting these few stitches, let's take a look at the pattern chart. In the middle of the following rows, there's a large section of stitches in the main color, without color 1. Color 1 is scattered on both sides, therefore, the color 1 yarn stays here. For this half, we need to add a new small ball of color 1 yarn for knitting. While the other half continues with the original small ball. We continue knitting this row. First, finish the corresponding number of stitches with the brought over main color yarn. Gently stretch the fabric after each color change. When done, add a small ball of color 1 yarn. And knit the few stitches in color 1, and bring over the main color yarn. When knitting color 1 next, carry the main color yarn along. When knitting the main color yarn, carry the color 1 yarn along. The main color yarn should be carried all the way to the beginning of the next row, which is roughly to this point, making it convenient for the return row. After knitting the color 1 here, switch to another small ball of main color yarn. After finishing this row, Now I finished this row. Next, let me summarize the key points of pattern knitting. Vertical yarn carrying. Cross the 2 yarns every time, which means ensuring that after knitting 1 stitch, the yarn not in use is pressed down. And after finishing each color, look ahead each time, where the next start position for that color is. Whether you need to carry the yarn in advance, carry it to a nearby position before pausing, or add a new small yarn ball, for example. Right here. After we finished a few stitches with color 1, we chose to add a small yarn ball to knit the color 1 here. Horizontal yarn carrying. When the number of stitches skipped is less than or equal to 3, switch colors normally. When more than 3, carry the yarn every 3 or so stitches. After each color change, after knitting the first stitch, gently stretch the fabric, ensuring the carried yarn isn't too tight. Otherwise, the fabric will shrink. You can see that horizontal and vertical yarn carrying are used together. You need to decide based on the pattern and your own preference when hiding yarn tails. For the tails at the pattern positions, try to hide them on the back at the boundary between 2 colors. You can also weave in the entire tail. Making sure that after weaving in, it doesn't affect the appearance of the right side. Next, follow the chart instructions for knitting. It's worth noting that there's a pattern at the neckline where you bind off. When binding off, use the thread from the last stitch of the previous row to knit. Each time you bind off the last stitch, the stitch you knit should be marked with the bind off symbol, using the corresponding color thread next to it. Knit the stitch, then bind off the last stitch. For the section with more bind-offs in the middle of the neckline, you can use the main color yarn to bind off while knitting the both sides together. After finishing the last row of the shoulders on each side, join the loops with those on the back piece and bind off. For example, if this side is the actual left side when worn, connect it with the left side of the back piece. If this side is the actual right side, when worn, connect it with the right side of the back piece. Please watch the demonstration of how to join and bind off. The first method is connecting stitch to stitch. This method is used when both are in loop form, and it's one of the more common joining methods. It involves binding off to join the pieces together. Commonly used for connecting the shoulders of the front and back pieces. Both pieces are in loop form. We consider the garter stitch side as the right side. Joining and binding off is usually done on the wrong side of the piece, which means you need to place the 2 pieces with their right sides facing each other. Typically, one of the pieces doesn't have the yarn cut. No matter which piece the yarn is attached to, place the side with the yarn tails on the right. When joining and binding off, you typically bind off while knitting the both sides together. That means going through both loops from both pieces at the same time, knitting and binding off as you go. The number of stitches on both pieces is usually identical. Just knit and bind off each corresponding stitch. If one piece has more stitches, you'll need to decrease on the side with more stitches while binding off. Assuming this piece has more stitches, you can insert your hook through 2 loops at once. Continue by inserting through 1 loop, knitting and binding off. If the back piece has more stitches, insert through both loops at the back, knitting and binding off. Here, both pieces have the same number of stitches, so I'll continue binding them off. Tie off the yarn tail and hide it. This is the effect after joining and binding off. That concludes the front piece. After finishing the front and back pieces, sew the sides of the body together. The sewing length can be according to the pattern instructions, or based on your own preference. The sewing here is row to row. You can pick up the horizontal strands along the edges. If you can't find them exactly, close enough will do. For specifics, please refer to the sewing method demonstration. Next, let's learn about row-to-row connection. We usually use a seamless sewing technique. When sewing, pick up the horizontal strands along the edges. Let's first get familiar with the fabric piece. First, locate the first stitch at the edge. The first stitch at the edge typically has 4 scenarios. The first scenario is a slip stitch, which means you slip the stitch without working it, creating a large braid. The second scenario is also a slip stitch, but when working the slip stitch, it goes against the texture below, forming this kind of knot. The third scenario is knitting every row, usually knitting on the right side, and purling on the wrong side, creating these small braids. The fourth scenario is also knitting every row, usually knitting on both the right and wrong sides, forming garter stitch. To the left of the first stitch is the second stitch. For example, with this fabric piece, looking at this side, the second stitch is knit texture. Looking at the other side, the second stitch is purl texture. Regardless if the second stitch is knit texture or purl texture, you can see that the loops are all facing forward. These inverted loops, the horizontal lines below, are the horizontal strands between stitches. The same on this side. These are inverted loops. This one is the horizontal strand between two stitches. When working garter stitch on the edge, it's the same. This is the second stitch. This column is the second stitch, with the loops facing forward. Between these two stitches, inverted loops, a strand like this, is the horizontal strand between two stitches. The edge is worked with slip stitches. Similarly, between these two stitches, there are also horizontal strands. No matter which type, one strand roughly corresponds to one row. Before sewing, you can hide the yarn tails for a few stitches on the wrong side, and tie a knot to secure them. I won't be hiding them here. Seamless sewing means picking up the horizontal strands along the edges, alternately on these two fabric pieces, to sew them together. Pick up 1-2 strands each time. Note, if the row counts match, you can sew them together evenly, meaning you pick up the same amount of strands each time. Always insert the hook where you last pulled out. To pick up the horizontal strand. Here, I'll pick up one strand each time. After sewing a few stitches, gently tighten. If the row counts differ, but you want to sew the fabric pieces together evenly, on the side with more rows, you can pick up a little more, for example, generally picking up one thread at a time. On the side with more rows, you can pick up 2 threads in appropriate spots. These 2 fabric pieces have matching row counts, so I'll continue sewing them together. This is the method for seamless sewing between rows. After completing the body, start picking up stitches around the neckline to knit the collar. Refer to the pattern for the number of stitches to pick up. Check the video demonstration for the method of picking up stitches in the first round. First, pick up and knit the first round. I'll demonstrate using this small sample. We start by picking up stitches from the back piece. You can see that the back piece is usually divided into 3 sections, the 2 sides and the middle part. Before picking up and knitting, you can first allocate the total number of stitches to pick up on the back piece across these 3 sections according to the requirements in the pattern. Typically, the middle section is picked up evenly, and the remaining stitches are distributed evenly across the 2 sides. For example, if I need to pick up 21 stitches on the back piece, I would pick up 11 stitches in the middle evenly. These 11 stitches are usually the same as the number of stitches from the tuck-in at the center. The remaining stitches are then picked up evenly, 5 on each side. For this round of picking up stitches, knit all the stitches. For these side edges, you're picking up a few strands along the edge. Note that you want to pick them up roughly evenly. Here, I'm using different, colored threads to demonstrate, which makes it convenient for watching. After picking up the stitches on the side, in the middle, pick up 11 stitches evenly. Once completed, for this side, continue by picking up 5 stitches evenly. Once completed, you'll reach the position of the front piece. Distribute the total number of stitches you need to pick up on the front piece across these 3 sections. For example, if I need to pick up a total of 39 stitches on this front piece, I've decreased 7 stitches in the middle here. So, pick up 16 stitches on each side, roughly distributing them evenly. After picking up all the stitches, check the number of stitches, then distribute them evenly onto 3 straight needles. That concludes the first round of picking up stitches. After the first round, according to the collar pattern instructions, you need to decrease stitches in the second round, which means decreasing 4 stitches evenly on the back piece, and decreasing 1 stitch on each side of the front pieces. You can start by using stitch markers to roughly mark the decrease positions. The specific number of decreases can also be adjusted as needed. After marking, begin knitting. The second round is mostly knit purl stitches. At the decrease points, use the left-leaning knit 2 stitches together method. Please watch this stitch demonstration. Left-leaning knit 2 stitches together, abbreviated as left-leaning purl decrease. When knitting, insert the right needle from right to left through both loops on the left needle. Work 1 purl stitch. The left-leaning purl decrease is complete. You can see that the left loop is above. I'll demonstrate again. Insert the right needle through both loops on the left needle. Work 1 purl stitch. This is the method for the left-leaning purl decrease. Starting from the third round, you work even, alternating 1 round of knit stitches with 1 round of purl stitches, which is the garter stitch pattern. Next, follow the chart instructions to finish the collar. After finishing, you need to bind off. I'll demonstrate the Icelandic bind off using this small swatch. This method is usually suitable for binding off garter stitch. First, knit 1 stitch. Then, transfer this loop to the left needle, moving it from left to right. Next, insert into the first loop from right to left. Then insert from left to right into the second loop. Knit 1 stitch. Release these 2 loops, which binds off 1 stitch. Continue transferring the loops on the right needle to the left needle. Then pick the second loop from underneath. Knit it. Which binds off another stitch. Repeat this process. Continue binding off. Until you have one loop left. Leave a tail about 15 centimeters before cutting the yarn. Slightly tighten. Weave the tail in along the texture on the wrong side. Then sew a few stitches to connect both ends with the yarn tail, ensuring there are no noticeable gaps. Finally, hide the tail. Or you can weave in the entire tail if you prefer. That's the Icelandic bind-off method. Up to this point, we've covered the vest. If you have any unclear parts during the crocheting process, don't hesitate to reach us via our customer service. Susan's family, one stitch at a time, enjoying the joy of life. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.